All right, so you sent me some really fascinating stuff on Christianity and Islam.
Yeah.
I'm excited to dive in and see, what we can find.
Right.
What's interesting, what's surprising. And we're not going to get bogged down in all the details. We really want to hit those like aha
moments for sure.
So we get a real feel for these two religions.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with this?
Well, one of the things that I think is most overlooked when we're talking about Christianity and Islam is they both share a common ancestor.
Oh, okay.
With Abraham.
Ah.
So they're both considered Abrahamic religions. They both trace their lineage back to Abraham.
Okay, so that's something they have in common.
Right.
I mean, they both have figures that they both revere. I'm thinking like Moses.
Yes.
Noah,
absolutely.
and even Jesus, actually.
And even Jesus. And that's where the road diverges.
Right.
Right. So you almost wonder, like, how much of the split was theological and how much of it was political? Were the early Christians perceived as a threat?
Right.
Or was it simply doctrinal?
Okay.
But for Christians, Jesus is like the cornerstone of the whole thing. He's the divine Son of God, the savior of mankind, the whole 9 yards. Islam views Jesus quite differently.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit.
Okay.
So for Christians, the Holy Trinity, right? You got the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Right.
This is like core to the whole thing.
Right.
And then his crucifixion, his resurrection. This is seen as like the pivotal moment for human salvation.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to me, the concept of the Trinity, that wasn't actually like a formulated thing until the 4th century.
Really?
Yeah, there was a lot of debate in early Christianity.
I can imagine.
And even like rifts.
Yeah.
And it caused some problems.
Yeah.
Formulating that idea. But so that belief in Jesus's divinity, that's really the key difference.
Yeah.
Because Muslims, they consider Jesus to be a prophet.
Yeah.
A messenger of God.
Right.
Highly respected. Absolutely. Born of a virgin.
Yep.
Performed miracles.
Ascended to heaven.
And ascended into heaven.
But not divine.
Right.
Right. So they don't accept the crucifixion or the resurrection.
Okay, so both religions acknowledge that he's important.
Hugely important.
But they have completely different ideas about who he was.
Exactly.
And what his life and death actually meant.
For sure.
Okay.
So to understand these differences, we really need to look at how both Christianity and Islam emerged and developed over time.
Okay.
Now, Christianity, it emerged in the 1st century.
Okay.
CE in the Roman province of Judea.
Okay.
Centered around the teachings and the life of Jesus of Nazareth.
Right. And Jesus was Jewish. So how did this new faith kind of branch out from its Jewish roots and become a distinct religion?
Well, that's the point, right?
Yeah.
The early Christians, they were Jewish, but their belief that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, this set them apart from traditional Jewish teachings. And this led to tensions and eventually a separation.
Okay, so it wasn't just his message.
Right.
It was the divinity aspect.
The divinity aspect that caused the split.
Okay.
Right. Because the Holy Trinity, that's a radical departure from Jewish monotheism.
Okay.
And so early Christians, they faced persecution from both Jewish and the Roman authorities.
Yeah, so they had a tough start. But they persevered. How did they manage to spread so rapidly despite all these obstacles?
Well, the message of salvation and eternal life really resonated, particularly in those tumultuous times.
Yeah.
And figures like Paul the Apostle
played
a crucial role in spreading this gospel beyond the Jewish community.
Yeah, his missionary journeys are legendary.
Yeah.
I mean, he really helped establish Christianity as a faith for both Jews and Gentiles.
Absolutely. And then there's the impact of Emperor Constantine.
Right.
His conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century, that was a game changer.
Yeah.
It provided the religion with legitimacy, protection, and it paved the way for its eventual dominance in the Roman Empire.
So from persecuted minority to the official religion of the most powerful empire.
Crazy, isn't it?
That's a huge change.
Yeah.
Speaking of rapid expansion, Islam's early growth was pretty remarkable as well.
Oh, absolutely.
It emerged in the 7th century CE in the Arabian Peninsula with the Prophet Muhammad right at the center. And it's interesting because that was a predominantly polytheistic region at the time.
It was.
And Muhammad received the revelations that formed the Quran.
Okay.
So how did this new faith gain such a strong foothold so quickly?
Well, like Christianity, Islam's monotheistic message really resonated with people. You know, they were seeking a simpler, more direct connection with God. It emphasized equality, social justice, and a strong community, which attracted a lot of followers. And I think what's interesting is early Islam had this fascinating school of thought called the Murji'a.
Okay.
And they emphasized tolerance. They believed that only God could judge a person's faith. Imagine that in that context.
Right. Okay, so it addressed both spiritual and social needs.
Precisely.
Okay.
And then there's a role of Muhammad himself. He wasn't just a prophet.
Right.
He was also a political and military leader.
Right.
And he unified the Arabian tribes under the banner of Islam.
Okay.
And this created a really powerful force that expanded rapidly.
So Islam's early growth was really intertwined with political and military might.
To a significant extent.
Okay.
Yeah. And within a century of Muhammad's death, the Islamic Empire stretched from Spain to Persia.
Wow.
Encompassing just this vast swath of territory and diverse cultures.
So within Islam, Muhammad is considered the final prophet.
That's right.
The one who received God's final revelations, which were compiled into the Quran.
Exactly.
This contrasts with the Christian view of the Bible as the ultimate word of God.
Right.
And speaking of the Quran, that's where we get this concept of Sharia law.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely.
This is something that's often generated a lot of discussion, I think.
A lot of discussion.
And maybe some misunderstanding as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Outside of Islam. So can you talk about that a little?
So Sharia, it means the way, basically. It's a set of Islamic principles derived from the Quran and the Hadith.
Okay.
The sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay.
That guide many aspects of life. So from prayer to financial dealings, it's a complex system.
Yeah.
And interpretations vary widely.
Within Islam.
Even within Islam. I mean, we're talking about over 1.6 billion Muslims worldwide.
Right.
So there's a vast spectrum of beliefs.
Right.
And practices.
Okay.
Right. And you might be surprised to learn that according to Pew Research, a majority of Muslims in several countries, like Egypt and Jordan, they believe that Sharia should be the law of the land. But then a majority in other countries like Turkey and Lebanon disagree.
Huh. So even that is open to interpretation.
It's open to interpretation.
Okay.
Right.
So it's hard to overstate the impact of the Quran. Right?
Hi.
I mean, it goes way beyond personal beliefs.
Absolutely.
It's almost like a constitution.
Yeah.
In some societies.
Right. That's a great way to put it.
And that's where this whole debate over Sharia gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Just like in Christianity, there's no single monolithic viewpoint.
No, not at all.
You have strict interpretations, you have more liberal ones, and then everything in between.
Right.
So how do the Bible and the Quran compare as these foundational texts for each faith?
Well, both are considered divinely revealed.
Okay.
However, there are key differences in their structure, their content, and how they're interpreted. Now, the Bible, it's a collection of books written over centuries. It includes historical accounts, poetry, prophecies, teachings.
It's like a library.
It is like a library with different genres and perspectives all kind of woven together.
Right.
Now, the Old Testament, which is shared with Judaism, that tells the story of creation. The Israelites, their covenant with God. The New Testament focuses on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who's seen as the fulfillment of God's promises.
Okay.
Now, the Quran, this is believed to be the literal word of God as revealed to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. And it's structured as a series of chapters or surahs, and they address a range of topics. From theology and ethics to social and legal matters.
So the Quran is seen as like this direct, uncorrupted revelation.
Absolutely.
Oh, God.
That's right.
Oh.
And that leads to a really crucial point about interpretation. In Christianity, you have a whole spectrum of interpretations, ranging from literal to metaphorical.
Right.
Some emphasize good works for salvation. Others stress faith alone.
Yeah.
And we see that in different denominations of Christianity even, right? Now, in Islam, the Quran is generally interpreted more literally. It's seen as this ultimate guide for life. And its teachings are applied to various aspects of society, forming the basis of Sharia law.
Okay, now we've touched on how both religions have these really fascinating and sometimes controversial apocalyptic visions.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious to explore those a bit further.
Yeah.
Where do they converge? Where do they diverge?
Well, both religions, they believe in a final judgment, a world that's cleansed of evil, and the return of Jesus.
Wait, Muslims believe Jesus is going to return?
They do.
Oh, that's something I had never heard before.
They believe that Jesus ascended to heaven and he will return during the end times, but not as the central figure of judgment.
Okay.
Some believe he will come as a follower of the Mahdi, which is a messianic figure in Islam,
Okay.
to establish justice and to defeat the Antichrist, or the Dajjal, as he's known in Islam.
Okay.
Other Muslims believe that Jesus will primarily come to clarify his teachings, correct misunderstandings that have arisen over the centuries.
So Jesus plays a role in both.
In both.
End times narratives.
Absolutely.
Just in very different ways.
In very different ways.
Okay. I'm officially intrigued.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Okay.
What are the key similarities, the differences?
Well, both traditions emphasize a day of reckoning, where humanity is judged for their deeds.
Okay.
In Christianity, it's often portrayed as a separation of the righteous from the wicked,
Okay.
with the saved going to heaven and the condemned going to hell.
Right.
Now, Islam has a similar concept of judgment. Those deemed worthy by Allah enter paradise, and those who are found wanting face punishment in hell.
So the basic concept of a final judgment and an afterlife
Very similar.
is shared,
Yes.
but the specifics are they vary.
They vary, exactly. And let's not forget the element of a transformed world.
Yep.
Both religions often depict a future world cleansed of evil, injustice, and suffering.
Right.
In Christianity, this is sometimes linked to the idea of the new heaven and new earth,
Okay.
described in the book of Revelation. In Islam, it's often associated with a period of peace and justice under the rule of the Mahdi, and in some interpretations, Jesus.
Okay.
Now, here's an interesting detail. You might find this surprising.
Okay.
Some Islamic traditions believe that upon his return, Jesus will break the cross,
Well.
kill the pig, and abolish the jizya, which is a tax historically levied on non-Muslims in some Islamic states.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty intense. What's the symbolism? I mean, obviously, this is a topic that sparks a lot of debate.
Yeah.
It's important to approach this with sensitivity and acknowledge different perspectives, both historical and modern.
Yeah.
But what's the symbolism behind that?
Well, breaking the cross is seen by some as a symbolic rejection of the Christian belief in Jesus' crucifixion and divinity. Killing the pig is linked to Islamic dietary laws that forbid the consumption of pork.
Right.
And abolishing the jizya is often interpreted as a sign of universal justice and equality
Okay.
under Islamic rule.
Okay. So these actions are really laden with symbolism,
Absolutely.
reflecting these core Islamic tenets.
Yes.
And expectations for the future. It really kind of highlights these contrasting perspectives on Jesus.
Right.
You know, his mission, his message
For sure.
between these two faiths. But I'm curious, how did these religions, with their shared origin, how did they end up evolving in such different ways? I mean, we've got to trace this back
Yes.
to their early history, right?
You're absolutely right. To understand these differences, we need to look at how Christianity and Islam emerged and developed over time.
I'm ready to explore the roots
Yeah.
of these two global faiths.
Let's do it.
in more detail.
So we've already touched on some of the key moments in Christianity's early history. You know, the role of Paul, the impact of Constantine. But it's worth emphasizing just how much those events shaped the religion's trajectory. You know, for instance, Paul's mission to the Gentiles. That was really controversial at the time. It raised questions about whether Christianity should remain tied to Jewish law
Right.
and customs or embrace a more universal message.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how different would Christianity be today if they hadn't made that leap beyond its Jewish origins.
That's a great question. It's impossible to say for sure, of course, but it's clear that Paul's efforts were really instrumental in making Christianity a global religion.
Okay.
And then Constantine's conversion, while often celebrated, it also introduced a whole new set of challenges.
What do you mean by challenges? I mean, wasn't his support a good thing?
It definitely provided stability and resources, but it also led to a closer entanglement between church and state,
Okay.
which some argue compromised the religion's original message. You know, this entanglement also led to power struggles and theological disputes,
Okay.
ultimately resulting in the split between the Eastern and Western churches in the 11th century.
So even as Christianity was solidifying its power,
Yeah.
there were cracks forming.
Exactly. It's a reminder that religious history is rarely straightforward.
Right.
It's full of twists, turns, internal conflicts that shape its evolution. Now, shifting gears to Islam, it's interesting to consider how its spread differed from Christianity's.
Okay.
While Christianity relied heavily on missionaries and conversions, Islam's early growth was more closely tied to territorial expansion and conquests.
Right. We talked about how Muhammad was both a religious and a political leader.
He was.
That must have played a role.
A significant role.
In how quickly it spread.
Oh, absolutely.
Across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond.
Yeah.
Were there other factors that contributed to its success?
Well, aside from the military aspect, Islam also offered a very compelling message that resonated with people from diverse backgrounds. It emphasized the oneness of God, social justice, and a strong sense of community.
Okay.
These values appealed to a lot of people who felt disenfranchised or marginalized by existing power structures. Plus, early Islamic leaders, they were generally tolerant of other religions.
Okay.
They allowed conquered people to practice their faith as long as they paid a tax. This policy is known as Dima, and it contributed to a relatively peaceful coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims in many parts of the Islamic Empire.
So tolerance played a role in Islam's expansion as well.
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that this tolerance had its limits.
Okay.
Non-Muslims were considered second-class citizens and faced certain restrictions. You know, it wasn't a perfect system.
Right.
And there were instances of persecution and conflict.
It sounds like a very complicated situation.
It was.
With both tolerance and tension kind of woven in. Yeah. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white.
Precisely. It's essential to avoid those simplistic narratives and acknowledge the complexities of the past.
Okay.
Now, speaking of complexities, let's dive into one of the most contentious and misunderstood aspects of Islam: Sharia law.
Yeah. We touched on it briefly.
Yeah.
But I think it deserves a deeper look.
I think so too.
What are some of the key things we should keep in mind when we talk about Sharia?
Well, first and foremost, Sharia is not a monolithic legal code.
Okay.
It's a set of principles and guidelines derived from the Quran and the Hadith that are open to interpretation and implementation.
Okay.
It covers a wide range of issues, from personal matters like prayer and fasting to social and legal issues like marriage, inheritance, and crime.
So it's not just about criminal punishments like some people might believe.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Sharia encompasses much more than that. It's about guiding Muslims towards a righteous life in all its aspects.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is that different schools of Islamic thought have developed different interpretations of Sharia over time.
So there's no single universally accepted version of Sharia law.
Exactly.
Wow.
And that's where things get tricky.
Right.
Some interpretations are very strict and literal, while others are more flexible, context-driven. The way that Sharia is implemented also varies widely, depending on the country, the culture, the political system.
That makes sense. It's like any legal system. There's always room for interpretation.
Exactly. And this diversity of thought within Islam is often overlooked in Western media, which tends to portray Sharia as this rigid and oppressive system.
Okay.
And it's crucial to remember that for the vast majority of Muslims, Sharia is simply a way to live a fulfilling and ethical life in accordance with their faith.
Okay.
Now, on that note, I think it's important to address a topic that often gets tangled up in discussions about Islam, the issue of women's rights.
Yeah, that's definitely an area where I think there are a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes.
Absolutely.
So how does Islam view the role of women in society?
Well, Islamic teachings emphasize the inherent equality of men and women in the eyes of God.
Okay.
Women are given certain rights and responsibilities that differ from men's, but these differences are often interpreted as complementary rather than hierarchical.
Okay.
For instance, Islam recognizes women's right to own property, inherit wealth, and engage in business.
Okay.
It also emphasizes the importance of education for both girls and boys. Now, of course, the actual lived experiences of women in Muslim-majority countries vary widely, depending on cultural norms, political systems, and interpretations of Islamic law.
So like with Sharia, there's a difference between the ideal and what actually happens.
Yeah, exactly. It's important to avoid making sweeping generalizations about the status of women in Islam. There are progressive interpretations that champion women's rights.
Okay.
And then there are more conservative interpretations that enforce traditional gender roles. It's a complex landscape.
It sounds like it.
That requires nuanced understanding.
Yeah, I'm starting to realize that there are no easy answers when it comes to understanding these religions.
You got it.
It's not simple.
It's not.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's about challenging our assumptions, exploring different perspectives, and embracing the complexities of faith and belief. Now, before we move on, I think it's worth touching on one more controversial aspect of Islam.
Okay.
The issue of jihad. It's a term that's often misconstrued and associated with violence and terrorism.
Yeah, that's something I've heard a lot about, but I don't know if I fully understand what it means.
Yeah. So jihad, in its most basic sense, means struggle or effort.
Okay.
It's not inherently about violence or warfare. In fact, the Quran recognizes different forms of jihad, with the most important being the greater jihad, which refers to the internal struggle against one's own base desires and temptations.
So it's about personal growth.
Exactly.
Self-improvement.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, there's also the lesser jihad, which refers to armed struggle in defense of Islam.
Okay.
This form of jihad is subject to strict conditions and rules of engagement outlined in Islamic law.
So it's defensive.
It is not offensive.
That's the traditional understanding, yes. However, as with many aspects of religion, there are different interpretations. Some extremist groups have twisted the concept of jihad to justify their violent actions. But it's crucial to remember that their interpretation is not representative of mainstream Islam.
So, like with Sharia and women's rights, it's important to avoid making generalizations.
Absolutely.
When it comes to jihad.
It's a complex concept.
With a rich history and diverse interpretations. To understand it fully, we need to move beyond simplistic definitions and engage with its nuances. Now, speaking of nuances, I think it's time we shifted our focus to a topic that might seem a bit unexpected. The artistic and intellectual contributions of both Christianity and Islam.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What kind of contributions are we talking about?
Well, for starters, both religions have inspired some of the most breathtaking works of art and architecture in human history. I mean, think of the soaring cathedrals of Europe, the intricate mosaics of Byzantine churches, the majestic mosques of the Islamic world.
Wow, yeah. I can definitely see the artistic influence.
And it's not just about visual arts. Both religions have also made significant contributions to literature, philosophy, science, and mathematics. I mean, think of Augustine, Aquinas, Rumi, Ibn Sina. These are just a few examples of thinkers who've shaped intellectual discourse for centuries.
It's amazing to think about how these religions have left such a profound mark on human civilization.
It is.
It goes way beyond just the beliefs.
For sure.
And the practices.
It's about the interconnectedness of faith, culture, and intellect. Now, to truly appreciate the global reach of these religions, we need to delve into their demographics and geographic distribution. Now, Christianity, with over 2 billion adherents, it's the world's largest religion. With a presence on every continent.
And Islam is the second largest.
With
over 1.6 billion.
Correct. And it's the predominant religion in a wide swath of countries from North Africa to Southeast Asia.
Like Indonesia, Pakistan, India.
Absolutely.
Have massive Muslim populations.
Huge.
I've also heard that Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in the world.
It is.
Especially in Europe.
It is.
What factors are driving that growth?
Factors like migration, higher birth rates among Muslim communities, and conversion are all contributing to this growth. And it's certainly reshaping the religious landscape in many parts of the world. And raising important questions about intercultural understanding and social integration. And within Islam, the Sunni branch is by far the largest, representing around 80–90% of Muslims globally. Shia Islam, the second largest branch, is concentrated in countries like Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon.
So just like with Christianity, we see this diversity within Islam as well.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that you can't just paint these religions with a single brushstroke.
You can't.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Historical roots, theological differences, scriptural interpretations, global demographics. What does all of this mean?
Right.
For someone trying to understand these faiths, what are the key takeaways we should keep in mind?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that both Christianity and Islam, while distinct in their beliefs and practices, they share a common Abrahamic heritage. They both emphasize monotheism, prophecy, and a belief in an afterlife.
Okay.
And this shared ancestry explains some of the surprising overlaps we've discussed, particularly in their apocalyptic visions.
Right, like the final judgment and the return of Jesus.
Exactly.
Different roles. Different roles, yeah.
But it's also crucial to acknowledge the fundamental differences.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, like the nature of God, the status of Jesus.
Exactly. Christianity's concept of the Trinity and Jesus' divinity is a stark contrast to Islam's strict monotheism and the view of Jesus as a prophet, not God incarnate.
Okay.
And we can't forget the impact of scriptural interpretation.
Right.
Both the Bible and the Quran are open to varying interpretations, leading to a spectrum of beliefs and practices within each faith. And this diversity is crucial to recognize, as it challenges simplistic generalizations and stereotypes. It's
not Christians believe this or Muslims believe that.
Exactly.
There's a whole range
of viewpoints within each religion.
Absolutely. And finally, we have to appreciate the global scale and influence of these faiths. With billions of adherents across the world, Christianity and Islam are shaping societies, cultures, and even political landscapes. Understanding their dynamics, both internal and in relation to each other, is essential for navigating our increasingly interconnected world.
This has been an incredible journey.
It has.
Really, I mean, filled with surprises, insights, and I have a newfound appreciation for the complexity of faith and belief. I feel like we only scratched the surface.
We did.
Though, right?
Yeah.
There's always more to learn, more perspective to consider, more nuances to uncover. So for our listener out there who's feeling intrigued and wants to keep exploring, what's like a thought-provoking question they could consider as they kind of continue this on their own?
Well, I think we've seen how both religions really grapple with interpretation. It makes you think. In a world of competing truths, what leads you to believe? What makes a story, whether religious or not, truly powerful and enduring?
That is a great question. It really encourages critical thinking, empathy, and just recognizing the diverse ways humans grapple with faith and spirituality.
Absolutely.
There are no easy answers, but that journey of exploration and understanding is invaluable.
It is.
So a huge thank you to you for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, keep that mind curious, that heart open, that knowledge-seeking spirit alive. Until next time, happy exploring.
Okay, so we're talking about these two major faiths with like a global footprint. But it's not just about the numbers.
No.
I imagine there's a lot of diversity within each religion.
Absolutely.
Based on where it's practiced.
That's right.
So let's zoom in on Christianity first. It's the world's largest religion.
Yes.
But it's not evenly distributed.
No, not at all.
Historically, Christianity has been strongest in Europe and the Americas, largely a legacy of colonialism and missionary activity. However, in recent decades, the global South, so we're talking Africa, Asia, and Latin America, have experienced really significant growth in Christian populations.
So the heart of Christianity is shifting south?
It appears so.
Wow. It's interesting how these historical forces kind of shape these trends.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And within Christianity itself, there's also a lot of internal diversity.
Absolutely.
Catholicism, that's still the largest denomination.
Yes.
Especially in Latin America.
Parts
of Europe. Protestantism, with all its different branches. That's prominent in North America, Africa, parts of Asia.
That's right.
And then we can't forget about Orthodox Christianity. Which has its stronghold in Eastern Europe, Russia.
Historically,
I'm curious, with all this internal diversity, how do the different Christian denominations, how do they view each other?
That's a great question.
I mean, it's almost like we're talking about different branches of the same family. Each with its own traditions, interpretations. Some are closer than others. Some have a history of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just shows you how complex this religious landscape really is.
It does. Now, turning to Islam, it has a predominantly Eastern distribution. The higher concentrations are in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia.
Like we say, Indonesia, Pakistan, India.
Huge Muslim populations.
Massive Muslim populations. And I've heard that Islam is one of the fastest growing religions
in
the world.
Especially in Europe.
What's driving that growth? And what are the implications for, interfaith relations in the future?
Well, factors like migration, higher birth rates among Muslim communities, and conversion are all contributing to this growth. And it's definitely reshaping the religious landscape in many parts of the world, raising important questions about intercultural understanding and social integration. And within Islam, the Sunni branch is by far the largest, representing about 80-90% of Muslims globally. Shia Islam, the second largest branch, is concentrated in countries like Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon.
So just like with Christianity, we see this diversity.
Absolutely.
It's not a monolith.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Lots of diversity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Historical roots, theological differences, scriptural interpretations, global demographics. What does it all mean?
Yeah, what's the takeaway?
Yeah, what are the key takeaways someone should keep in mind if they're trying to understand these faiths?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Both Christianity and Islam, while distinct in their beliefs and practices, they share that common Abrahamic heritage. They both emphasize monotheism, prophecy, and a belief in an afterlife. And this shared ancestry helps explain some of the overlaps we've discussed, particularly in their apocalyptic visions.
The final judgment, the return of Jesus.
Exactly.
In different roles.
In different roles, yeah.
But we've also got to acknowledge the fundamental differences between these two faiths.
Absolutely.
Particularly when it comes to the nature of God. The status of Jesus.
For sure. Christianity's concept of the Trinity, Jesus' divinity, this is a stark contrast to Islam's strict monotheism and view of Jesus as a prophet, not God incarnate. And then we can't forget the impact of scriptural interpretation. Both the Bible and the Quran are open to varying interpretations, leading to a spectrum of beliefs and practices.
It's not like Christians believe this or Muslims believe that. No, there's a whole range
there's a spectrum
of viewpoints within each religion.
Absolutely. And finally, I think we have to appreciate the global scale and influence of these faiths. With billions of adherents across the world, Christianity and Islam are shaping societies, cultures, even political landscapes. Understanding their dynamics, both internal and in relation to each other, is essential for navigating our increasingly interconnected world.
This has been an incredible journey.
It really has.
I mean, filled with surprises, insights,
it's a pleasure.
A newfound appreciation for the complexities of faith and belief.
Absolutely.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, we have.
There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more nuances to uncover.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners out there who are feeling intrigued and want to kind of continue exploring on their own, is there like a thought-provoking question they could consider as they keep going with this?
Well, we've seen how both religions grapple with interpretation.
Right.
And it makes you think. In a world of competing truths, what leads you to believe? What makes a story, whether religious or not, truly powerful and enduring?
That's a fantastic question. It really encourages our listeners to think critically, to be empathetic.
Absolutely.
And to recognize the diverse ways that humans grapple with faith and spirituality.
For sure.
There are no easy answers. But the journey of exploration and understanding is invaluable.
It is.
So a huge thank you to you for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep that mind curious. Keep that heart open. Keep that knowledge-seeking spirit alive.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy exploring.